Good afternoon. After repeating, or more precisely, during the last course, I try to refer to psychoanalysis as one of the main classical approach in psychology, and I try to focus on the main interest of psychoanalysis, referring to the unconscious emotional life, and I refer to the importance of love and hate in psychoanalysis, and these emotional references are important in psychoanalysis to assess personality. And Freud was or created this approach to understand in a better way the psyche, and by creating psychoanalysis, Freud became against shared classical values and ideas, and he created the concept of the unconscious, and this is one of the main concepts in psychoanalysis. We also mentioned the importance of the concept of free association, and this concept refers to the importance to allow the patient to overcome his psychological difficulties, and this to overcome psychological difficulties is could be reached by applying free associations that allow the patient to understand himself by remembering his psychological traumas, and he could be able to overcome these traumas, and this is the main goal for psychoanalysis, to make the patient a balanced subject. And when the person is going to the psychoanalyst, and he is a patient, but when he performs free association to face his childhood historical childhood period, referring to psychological traumas during mainly the 6 years of his or her life, the patient transform himself more and more, and more the patient is able to understand his history, his historical emotional life, he becomes a subject. In other words, the part of the unconscious, the part of the unconscious life is transformed from its traumatic parts and the unconscious parts, and from the part of the patient that is that he or she forgets, and more we transform what we forget, and what we forget becomes what we remember, and this transformation transform the patient who becomes a subject. And when we refer to the subject from the psychoanalytical outlook, when we become a subject, we become aware about his history, and more we become aware, more we become aware about our history, more we transform the unconscious part of our personality, which becomes the conscious part of our life. And this is why at the beginning we refer to the patient, but at the end of the psychoanalytical treatment, the patient becomes a subject. And this is the main goal of psychoanalysis, that is that the patient could reach, or the subject could reach, by by performing free association as a technique, which is the tool by which the psychoanalyst encourage and help the patient to apply for being able to transform his history from what he faced during his childhood period. And this period is the patient forget this period, and the patient try to remember this period, and this is the main goal to reach by the patient during the psychoanalytical treatment. And this is very important in psychoanalysis, and very important also for treating and enabling the patient to transform himself. Now I will share with you, sorry, this to share with you this file, the PDF file, and as we mentioned that the hallmark of psychoanalysis is the assumption that much mental activity is unconscious, and that understanding people requires interpreting the unconscious meaning underlying their overt or manifest behavior. And that is one of the main presupposition or preconception of psychoanalysis, because for psychoanalysis, the overt behavior is just what we can see from the external part of the psyche, but what is at stake is not external. What is at stake is hidden, and to be able to from psychoanalysis, if we want to understand the patient, it is important to go over what is external. It is important to go deeply and to move from the conscious part of the life of the patient to the unconscious part of the unconscious part of the life of the patient. And when we move from what is external to what is internal, from taking into account the emotional part, the emotional internal part of the psyche, we can understand the essential part of the psyche, and this is the goal of psychoanalysis. We have also, it is important also to mention that psychoanalysis, often shortened to analysis, focuses primarily then on the influence of such unconscious forces, as we mentioned, as a repressed impulses, because the emotional life that is that is important for psychoanalysis is the emotional life, which is referring to the repressed impulses. When we refer to repressed impulses, it means we are referring to our desire, and these desires are not satisfied, and we are not able, when we are not able to perform our desires in various ways, these desires are repressed, and we repress our desires because there are values, and there are moral values, and there is a religion, and or religious values and social values which are facing our desire to be implemented. And this is why the impulses are repressed, because the impulses or our desires are not satisfied. And the reason why the impulses are transformed from the desire to be satisfied to be hidden in the unconscious part of the psyche, and this is contributing to the apparition, the gradual apparition of the unconscious, and which is and this is raising internal conflict, because I want, for example, I want to satisfy this or that desire, but at the same time, I am afraid to satisfy this or that desire, and I am leaving a kind of internal conflict between the desire to between saying that I want to satisfy this desire, and at the same time I am not able to satisfy the same desire that I want to satisfy, and this is creating an internal conflict, because there is also an external conflict. The external conflict appears when these moral or religious values are represented by somebody, the father or the mother, or and after other authorities like the teacher, or like the imam, or like other authorities in this or that society. And the reason why the external conflict, when the external conflict appears, like when the father will say, the father or the mother are saying, do not this, you have to do this and not to do that, etc. And this is creating at the beginning an external conflict because the impulses or the desires are internal, and these impulses want to become external, and when these impulses are moving from their internal uh, movements to their external movements. They are facing they are facing uh, 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 they are facing these moral values. They are also facing prohibitions, and when the desires are facing from the external life prohibitions, like you don't have the right to do this, and you will not do this and that, doing this or that is prohibited. And these prohibitions, which are external, are internalized inside the subject, and the subject is a living internal conflict between saying I want to satisfy this or that desire, and this is one voice, and there is another voice which is opposed to the first voice, and the second voice a force, and the second voice is saying you have not the right to do this or that. It is prohibited to satisfy this or that desire. And this is creating an internal conflict. And this is the source of the operation of the unconscious forces, which are the main interests of psychoanalysis. There is also childhood traumas on the mental life and adjustment of the individual. And when we refer to childhood traumas, we are referring to a part of the unconscious forces that are constituting the unconscious life of the subject. And when we refer to the childhood traumas, we are referring to the main period, which is the main interest of psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis was focusing from the beginning of this approach on this period, referring to childhood period, which is from psychoanalysis from the period that the person from the period when the person born to 6 years, and this period of 6 years are representing the main childhood traumas, which are constituting the unconscious part of the psyche. And all other psychological conflict and problems and difficulties which are appearing after this period are just the manifestations or the psychological manifestations of this first period, which is the 6 years of the childhood life. We have also to mention that the foundations on which classical psychoanalysis rest are the concept of infantile sexuality, because we have to mention that the concept of infantile sexuality is referring to the importance of sexual life during the 6th year of the life of the person, because it is when and here when we refer to sexuality, it is important to mention that sexuality doesn't refer just to physiological desires, but it is in between what is physiological and what is psychological, and the reason why the sexual life from psychoanalysis is in between the body and the psyche. We cannot separate. Both of them are combined, and both of them are referring to sexuality as the main interest of psychoanalysis. And here, when we refer to sexuality, we can say, in other words, that to satisfy desire or do not satisfy desires are representing what is at stake when we refer to sexuality as the main emotional life, which is which is the main subject matter of psychoanalysis. And here I think it is important to clarify the concept of sexuality. Again, it is not just a physiological activity. It is in between what is referring to the body and what is referring to the psyche, taking into account various scenarios which are constituting the history of the sexual life of the subject, and this is what constitutes the main subject matter of psychoanalysis. And here, of course, psychoanalysis redefined the concept of sexuality, and it's this approach, referring to psychoanalysis, expressed and built a large meaning of sexuality, rather than to reduce it to just a physiological activity. And this is the one of the main contribution, original contribution of psychoanalysis, when we refer to the concept of sexuality or infantile sexuality as one of the main concepts in psychoanalysis. There is also a second concept which is also very important, and here we refer to the Oedipus complex. And here we are referring to an important concept too in psychoanalysis. The Oedipus complex appears in after 5 years, and before before the Oedipus complex, the subject and referring to the childhood period, the subject is just satisfying his desires partially because he is at the beginning to satisfy desires is related to the mouth because he is drinking milk by his lips, and the reason why the child is just satisfying partially his desires because it's a partial satisfaction of the desires. Then the child is then the child is the child is throwing feces, which means there is a satisfaction, there is a desire to throw feces, and this is also a partial satisfaction of desires. And but when the child reach the Oedipus complex period, the child is referring to the masculine child. The child is loving his mother, and he is hating his father. The child is expressing hate toward his father, and this is here we remark that the child is expressing love toward the whole image of the mother, and he is at the same time expressing hate toward the whole image of the father. And here we are referring to satisfying desire of love and hate globally and not partially. The reason why the concept of the Oedipus complex is very important in psychoanalysis, because it refers to the global psychological emotional life of the subject, which is defining what is at stake emotionally and psychologically speaking from the psychoanalytical perspective. The reason why this concept is very important in psychoanalysis. There is also the theory of instinct or drives, and here I think we can refer to the theory of drives rather than the theory of instinct, because here in French we distinguish between instinct and pulsion, and in Arabic we can differentiate between al-muthir and between الدافع, and this is a very important difference, because when we refer to instinct, it is we are referring mainly to physiological impulses, and this is the instincts are characterizing mainly animals, because they are not experiencing fantasies, and they are not remembering, and they are not experiencing scenarios in their conscious part of their psyche or the unconscious part of the psyche, because the unconscious is a human life. It's specific to the unconscious life. The unconscious sexual life is specific to human being, because just a human being is able to imagine desires, even he or she is not able to satisfy his or her desires. But also when the subject is satisfying his or her desires, he or she is imagining and his or her desires, and he is expressing fantasies about his or her desires, and this is specific to human being. The reason why when we refer to impulses, we refer to drives rather than to refer to instinct, and the instincts are specific to animals because they are not experiencing fantasies, etc. But because a human is experiencing fantasies and scenarios, and the human being is imagining his or her desires, we are referring to drives rather than to instinct. And this is the main difference between drives and instinct when we refer to the way by which the human being is satisfying his or her desires. There is also a difference between the pre-pleasure principle and the reality principle. Briefly speaking, when we refer to the pleasure principle, we are referring to various drives by which various drives that the subject want to satisfy without any limit and without and without any prohibitions. The reason why the pleasure principle does not know the time and the space. The pleasure principle is external to space. It is external to time. It is external any limits. And when we refer to the reality principle is referring to moral values, to religious values, to social values. And the reality principle is referring mainly to the limit, to the rule, and to a law and a symbolic law. And this is the main difference between the pleasure principle, which is referring to disorders, and the reality principle, which is referring to the order. And there is a continual conflict between pleasure principle and reality principle, and the pleasure principle is referring to the way by which the unconscious life is expressing itself, and the reality principle is expressing the way by which the conscious life is expressing itself. And during the process of applying free associations, the psychoanalyst is encouraging the patient to become aware, to live the conscious life, and to be aware about what does mean pleasure principle in his or her, in the life of the patient, and how the pleasure principle becomes becomes lived during the history of the patient, and how and why to express the pleasure principle, and the same for the reality principle. The reality principle during the applying the free association with the psychoanalyst. The psychoanalyst encourage the patient to know what does mean the reality principle and how this principle becomes lived during the history of the patient. And at the same time, it is important during the free association, applying the free association to for the patient to become aware about how and why the reality principle becomes lived during the history of the patient. And when the patient becomes more and more aware about both principles, referring to pleasure principle and reality principle, the patient becomes a subject, and the patient is able to transform the unconscious life, which becomes the conscious life. And this is the goal of leading leading and applying the technique of free association during the therapy, the analytical therapy. And thank you.